Okay, so here are the typical things that come to mind when we think about addiction. Things like alcohol and drugs and gambling, and shopping and sex. Then there's this next level down where the consequences, they tend not to be as blatant. Things like video games, exercise, TikTok, eating, figgy pudding. I'm going to suggest that there is an even more subtle form of addiction that we all fall prey to. And in fact, it's very, very normal and very, very common. But normal and common, they don't necessarily mean healthy. And in fact, because it can be so subtle, it can actually be among the least healthy of all, guiding our entire lives without us ever realizing it. And it's more subtle because all of these things, those are behaviors. They're overt. We do the behavior, we experience pleasure, right? That rush of neurotransmitters. But we can actually trigger a dopamine release with something as simple as a thought. Of course we can. Like even thinking about something as simple as a cozy blanket or a scented candle or a friend who's come to help you or the sun on your face. And even if you are not trapped at the bottom of a well, and trust me, there is just so little dopamine down there, you would not believe it. But even if you are a topsider, this is still going to be mostly true for you. Okay, so then there are two main points that I want to make. First is we use our thoughts to chase small dopamine fixes. And this is a little bit of a twist on how we typically look at the traditional cognitive therapy model. It says that we have thoughts and those trigger emotions, and so the goal of therapy is often to manage undesirable emotions by managing thoughts. What I'm suggesting here, though, is that we choose certain thoughts because they lead to certain desirable emotions, because those emotions, they're paired with pleasure. But the kicker is that we don't usually recognize that we're choosing those thoughts. It's pre-rational. And that's what makes them so dangerous, is because they can fly under the radar for so long. Okay, and then the other main point I want to make is this, and that granted, this one's kind of weird, is that those emotions that we're chasing, those are often ones that we think of as negative. Emotions like anger or sadness or disgust or fear. And it's like why would anyone want to choose those? Again, it's because under certain circumstances, those emotions can be paired very tightly with pleasure, with that dopamine. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying under all or even most, but some. All right, let me give you some examples. And I'm going to focus on anger first because I think that is the one that is least likely to be misconstrued. Okay, so let's say that someone's just got this really irritating thing they do. Like there is someone in your friend group and they just have these little ways of being dismissive of your opinions. And what's most frustrating is like it's subtle enough that you can't really call them out on it without looking petty, but like, it's obnoxious. Like you suggest that you all go out to Fuddruckers for dinner. And Bernadette, she's like, oh, didn't we go to Fuddruckers for dinner last night and like for breakfast this morning? And like, yes, like technically that is true, but that's also, first of all, like what's your point? All right. And then also like, you don't need to say it like that. All right. So then that night after dinner, you're driving home from Fuddruckers and you're dwelling on all the other times she did that. And so you imagine the argument you're going to have and how you are just going to absolutely demolish her. And she's going to be like, oh, well, it's not healthy to have that many hamburgers. And you're going to go, oh, well, if you're so opposed to hamburgers, why did you call yourself Mayor McCheese all through high school? And she's going to be like, no, I didn't. That's what the mean girls called me because of the shape of my head. And then you're going to go in and you're going to finish her. And you're going to be like, oh, well, congratulations, Bernadette. Now you're finally one of the mean girls. All right. And it is perfectly normal to have this sort of internal imaginary conversation in your head. Like there is not a single thing that I just described that is in the tiniest way abnormal. The problem is when we come back to that same fantasy the next afternoon while we're waiting to get a prescription filled, or then that night while we're lying in bed. And part of the reason why we come back to it is because it's an issue that's gnawing on our unconscious and our brain, it wants some closure. But what makes it so tempting, what makes it like so attractive, is the pleasure that comes with that ruminating. Replaying it does make us angry, yes, but there is also that kind of sweet, sweet dopamine, right? And that is why when we have an issue with Isaac next week, we come back to that same pattern. Our brain, it knows that there's some goodies there to be had. And if we just stew a little bit, we can get a little bit of a fix. And maybe it's not even a current or an active relationship we have. Like it could be a resentment from our past that we're dwelling on, like an ex, or the way a teacher or a parent treated us, right? And it doesn't even need to be resentment towards a person. It could be towards a group of people or towards an institution. But it's dwelling on that wrong committed, just how unfair it was, and potentially how we're gonna just put them in their place. And we tell ourselves that we have to dwell on these things because of what an injustice it was. But too often, a big part of the appeal of coming back to these patterns is because it actually delivers us that thinly veiled dose of pleasure. And venting, I think this is another really great example. It's advertised as this healthy tool to help us express our frustrations and work through them. And it frankly, it feels great in the moment. And again, we tell ourselves we must do it. Like let's imagine you're something with your roommate, for example. Like they basically insist on living in your only bathroom, or they insist on living in your walls. And you've had to rip holes in all of your oil paintings because that is the only way that they'll make eye contact. So you have your friends over and you're going to vent about how annoying it is, right? And it feels like you have to, right? It's cathartic. Actually, though, the research, it's pretty consistently showing us that venting tends to make us feel worse after that in-the-moment dose of pleasure dissipates. And also, just because you don't hear their breathing or any scuffling noises, that does not mean that they are not listening to that entire conversation. Okay, let's take another negative emotion, disgust. And politics is just an absolutely fantastic example of us giving ourselves permission to indulge in pleasurable disgust, which we actually have another name for, which is self-righteousness. And we've got like tens of millions of people indulging in this every single day, watching hours and hours and hours of partisan cable news, which if you notice, they spend very little time discussing all of the positive things that their side is doing to help the world. And instead, what they focus on is how absolutely disgusting the other side's behavior is. And it sells because of the pleasure it gives us. And you can also see this if you read the comment section of just about any news article, right? That this instinct, this is why those things are such cesspools. But as a side note, if you do ever find yourself in the comment section and you can't, for whatever reason, seem to break free, just try to remind yourself that somewhere on the dark web, there is a comment section on your comment section, and that thing is even more devoid of joy and insight and wit than yours. Things can always be worse. And the same thing can happen with other traditionally negative emotions, like, for instance, sadness. Now, this is where I want to be super careful that this is not confused with depression or confused with something like mourning or dealing with a trauma or many of the other unpleasant but healthy and necessary ways that our brain uses sadness to process our experiences going through life. But having said that, there are times where we can take pleasure in wallowing. Like we've all wallowed in self-pity before. You take the self-talk. Like how many times have you said to yourself something like, nobody cares about me. Why does this always happen to me? And it can actually feel good in kind of a weird sort of way. And this isn't necessarily always a bad thing. Like if you've just been through a breakup and you need to indulge into some dopamine-infused sadness, listening to sad songs, like songs about breakups or nostalgia for better times or nostalgia for a simpler time, like when you saw them across a crowded hall and they saw you. But now you need to get back to your own timeline. You failed in your mission to kill baby Hitler, but your biggest failure was not telling them how you really felt when you had the chance that night. And you know what? That can be a really nice way to find a hint of enjoyment in a really, really crappy situation. It's more of a question of, does this become a reoccurring source of escape for you in weekly life? Do you find yourself returning to self-pity or feeling like a victim or ruminating on past losses because there's that sense of relief in it? And if you do, this should not be a source of shame, right? It is natural. This is just a mechanism that your brain has stumbled onto to help you navigate difficult times, right? Other people, they might not use that mechanism, but I guarantee you they use other ones. Right? We all cope differently. And just one more time, to be absolutely clear, do not use this to diagnose or dismiss other people's sadness or anger or anxiety, right? This is really just for self-reflection and understanding our own experiences. Again, it's very, very natural. It's just that natural, it doesn't always equal healthy. Okay, so why is it unhealthy? And basically for a lot of the same reasons that traditional addictions are unhealthy, just a lot more subtle. So first of all, there is the come down or the hangover. Right, so let's imagine you are a 1980s stockbroker and you just railed 32 linear feet of premium coke. Yes! It is a good thing too, because you got a pump and dump coming up in 10 minutes. So your mood is going to spike way above the baseline and you are just feeling so good that you totally leverage this super sweet buyout. It's leveraged all over the walls, it's like everywhere. It feels so good. All right, but then eventually you start to come down, even below your normal baseline. So you start name dropping super hard, like as hard as you can, because normally that makes you feel better, but it's not working. It's like you're tired and you're irritable and depressed, and you begin to question, why do I even need suspenders? Have I been using them wrong this entire time? But then enough time passes and you start to get back to that baseline. Unless you're doing this all the time, and that's a big unless. It's a very similar mechanism with thoughts, just much, much, much less pronounced. So let's say, for instance, we indulge in stewing, right? Just really focusing on how awful so-and-so is, right? And so there's the anger there, but there's also the pleasure. But eventually we take our foot off the pedal and we stop stewing, and very quickly that pleasure disappears. But that anger or resentment or irritation, that lingers with us. We've indulged so deeply in that emotion, it leaves us in a bit of a mood. Now, of course, we can wait for the mood to lift, but unless we get distracted, our brain, it does this thing where it goes into autopilot trying to correct the situation. How can we get out of this funk? Well, let's do something pleasurable. Well, what's that thing we just did a couple minutes ago? That was pretty good, all right? And you guessed it, we kind of loop back in. And a long-term consequence of this hangover cycle is that it reinforces negative thought patterns. Those neural networks, they get stronger and stronger each time, and it becomes more and more automatic over time for our brain to reach out for that as a source of pleasure, or even just as a source of relief from distress. And so what happens is we get into this pattern where anytime we're at a bit of a low point and we have space for reflection, we come back to this indulgence because our brain, it knows it can get just a little bit of a fix here. Not huge, it's subtle, but enough to help us escape those doldrums. And the sinister thing about this whole thing is these patterns are usually well outside of our conscious awareness. So what can we do about this? And I want to repeat again, there is absolutely no shame in this. We all do it instinctively. And in one sense, it can be a particularly difficult addiction to quit because it is not overt and behavioral. It's subtle and internal. And also, the consequences of it are not nearly as disruptive as the things that we normally think of as addiction. So there's rarely this urgency to address these patterns. But there are a couple of pieces of good news. One is that because the rewards for these thoughts are much, much less intense than the rewards for those traditional behavioral addictions, it can be much easier to break these cycles if we really put our minds to it. The subtlety, it makes it both easier and more difficult. The other piece of good news is that there are these really well-established cognitive techniques out there that millions of people have used to reshape their mental patterns, right? Stuff that can be used and has been used with like stress management and phobias, like OCD and self-esteem issues, and not UTIs though. That is 100% antibiotics. Like, I cannot stress that enough. Okay, but I will link a couple of good videos below, both on cognitive behavioral therapy and on treating urinary tract infections. Just completely different videos. And like, if you think both might be appropriate and you're struggling to decide which one to watch first, like, if there is any question, just like watch the one on UTIs. But with cognitive techniques, big picture, it's two basic steps. First, you're monitoring your thoughts, you're becoming aware of your patterns, and then two, you're interrupting them. It definitely takes some willpower and some focus, right? A large part of that is because we tell ourselves that we have to focus on just how wronged we've been, or how stupid this person is, or how awful the situation is. And we tell ourselves that we're contributing to some sort of cosmic justice by indulging in this stuff, when really we're just holding ourselves back. And then one final thing that I want to repeat here is that these insights, they are not for diagnosing other people. There are very appropriate times for feeling sadness or anger or fear or anxiety. These emotions, they help us process difficult experience. Evolution, it gave us these things for a reason. And likewise, depression and anxiety disorders, stuff like that, they are very different than what I've been describing here. There is no pleasure in those. And I think that's one of the keys, is that when the negativity, it starts to feel good, well, that's a sign that our brain may keep directing us back to that place again and again and again. And generally speaking, that is not a place where most of us want to live.